The purpose of this project is to analyze the differences between two shows and how they approach violence, sexual content, and language. Hello, minions of the internet! Yes, I stole that from our professor, but I don't care because I had to listen to that about 8 times, so now you guys get to listen to it one more time if you end up watching this. Today, for my final project, I am breaking down the first episode of a show called The Expanse and one called Lost in Space. And I'm going to be breaking down them in 3 categories. Those categories are violence, sexual content, and language. Now, to give you a little bit of clarification on my intentions in this, violence can refer to anything physical, such as somebody hitting each other, to an explosion, to somebody yelling or treating another person poorly. All of those are different forms of violence in my mind, so these are going to be different forms of violence that I'm going to be counting up. Sexual content is anything that is sexual, from a kiss all the way to a full-blown sex scene. Language is essentially anything that can be considered in the English language to be a swear word. You know, we all know what they are. I'm not going to list them off here, but there's a bunch of them. And depending on the severity of a swear word, I will rate that on a scale from 1 to 10. In fact, all of these categories are going to be rated in 2 ways. 1, the sheer amount of the events, and 2, on a scale from 1 to 10, which at the end I'll take an average of the events to give you like an average violence score for the first episode of each show. Notably with these 2 shows, one is rated TVMA and the other is TVPG. However, they are both science fiction shows set in a semi-realistic world for us to be able to see. Now, let's get started with The Expanse. Alrighty, let us talk about the first episode of The Expanse. Now, in the first category that we have is the category of violence in The Expanse. Now, Expanse, let's be honest, is kind of a violent show. In the first episode, it had a total of 27 acts of violence with an average rating of 4.4. Now, with the peak of that rating, I was giving it to 2 spots. One was a torture scene on Earth between somebody that is known as a belter who did not grow up in Earth gravity and thus cannot withstand it, being hung on hooks underneath their arms, essentially doing what is called gravity torture, which I consider to be an extremely violent scene, even though no blood or gore was shown in that scene. The other scene was somebody that was working on what is called an ice hauler, and in that scene, you can see somebody's arm get broken off by a chunk of ice that slams them into a wall. And you can actually see the arm floating in the air, and then later on you can see them fixing the arm and repairing it. These are 2 notable examples of pretty extreme violence in the show itself, and they are very realistic depictions of violence overall. Going into sexual content on The Expanse, the first episode had a total of 9 incidences with an average rating of 4.3 out of 10. This did have a peak incidence of a 9 out of 10, however. Within the first 15 minutes or so of the episode, there was a sexual scene that was shown in 0 gravity from a distance. The reason I did not give it a 10 out of 10 is because even though they were very clearly having sex, you could not see any actual genitalia in that scene itself. Okay, now that we've finished with sexual content, let's go into language. The first episode of The Expanse had a total of 18 uses of profane language with an average score of 4. No super high peaks or lows, no F-bombs actually in the first episode except for one that I might have heard, but I didn't count it as a full 10 out of 10 because it was under somebody's breath and did not show up on the subtitles on the screen itself. So it was fairly heavy and consistent language if most of the language was of a lower range as opposed to like a series of F words or things like that. Alrighty, now that we have finished analyzing The Expanse a little bit and breaking down those numbers, let's go into Lost in Space. Lost in Space, just for those of you that have never seen it, is a show that is about a family that goes on a journey to another planet to be part of a human colony there, and along the way they get lost in space and end up having to deal with hostile planets as a family, and hostile aliens and other life forms. Now in this very first episode, uniquely enough, it had 41 acts of violence in the first episode with an average score of 3.05 that I rated. Now, that is a lower average score than The Expanse. However, consistency with violence alongside the whole episode was much higher, especially verbal and other types of violence. Plus, notably, I did raise a lot of the violence scores by a couple of points because they were dealing with kids as opposed to just purely adults, which changes the final outcome on the score tally, actually raising that average up a little bit. So most of the violence in the episode is rather minor violence, but is still very consistent across the entire breadth of the episode. As opposed to The Expanse, there's moments where it slows down and characters talk. Lost in Space, it's pretty much beginning to end action, violence, things exploding, different things going on, kids getting lost in the woods. It's pretty intense. Now let's get into sexual content and language for Lost in Space. I'm going to loop these into one kind of discussion point because they're pretty simple. There's only one incidence of any form of sexual content in Lost in Space. I gave it a 1 out of 10. Husband and wife kiss each other. I mean, kind of sexual content, not really. It's super brief, and the kids laugh at them and tell them to get a room. Super chill. And then as per languages, there is only 3 incidents of language in the first episode, with one notable thing that somebody says the B word in the first episode, which I would argue is a more intense word than is used in the entire first episode of The Expanse, which doesn't have anything that rates at a 9 out of 10 on my scale, which that does. Alrighty, so now that we have been able to look at both The Expanse and Lost in Space and kind of break down their numbers a little bit, let's look at both of them side by side and compare them to each other. So obviously The Expanse tends to be more violent, more sexual, and have more language across the board than Lost in Space. But that's not the only factor to consider. We can consider, amounts as well as opposed to just averages. Because while The Expanse does tend to be more violent on average than Lost in Space on what it does depict less violence overall throughout the course of the episode. Which is interesting. So if you were thinking of watching it, Lost in Space is a much more action-focused show, where The Expanse tends to have other things going on and be more adult-oriented and be willing to pull back and let people speak to each other a little bit more on screen, punctuated by when violence does occur, it's very intense and very in your face. Whereas Lost in Space, violence tends to kind of occur throughout the scope of the episode. It tends to be a bit less serious, I guess, and less intense of violence as compared to The Expanse. And obviously The Expanse has way more sexual content and language than Lost in Space itself does have. Notably, I don't know if I would recommend either of these shows for young children. Because even though Lost in Space violence does seem to be a lot less, it is very consistent across the board. And for any children that are younger than 7, we know from studies earlier in this class that we've discussed that they cannot differentiate very well between what can happen in the real world today and what's a theoretical monster. And there are worse monsters in Lost in Space that you see in the first episode than The Expanse that are scarier for little kids. So I don't know that I'd recommend either of these shows for young kids. But Lost in Space, once kids are a little bit older, older than about 7, 8 years old, I would say, it's fair for them to be able to go out and watch this show, recognizing that, hey, they may have questions about some scenes, and some scenes may be kind of intense for them, so maybe you would like to view this before your children. The Expanse, I wouldn't recommend to any children at all. It's an intense, violent, gory, sexual show. It's good for adults that can kind of handle that type of content, but we also need to recognize that even if we think we can handle it and it won't affect us, studies show that we can be affected by content without realizing how it's affecting us. So we need to be careful with what we watch and recognize, hey, maybe this is a bit too violent and it's making me angry or upset or excited in ways that I shouldn't be. And think about this when we think about the comparison of these two shows. It is ultimately interesting to note that the show generated for kids tends to be more action-oriented the entire time and less dialogue-focused than the show purely for adults. But that is my breakdown of The Expanse and Lost in Space from a media effects perspective. Ultimately, everybody makes their own decisions about what's appropriate for them to watch. If you want to watch either of those shows, I've seen both of them, and I feel like I'm not a terrible human being, so enjoy watching what you want to watch. Just do it as an educated consumer.